Good evening, everyone. Thank you, Chairperson, for the invite, and to the commissioners for the opportunity to be here. We created an overview, a PowerPoint overview, to sort of give a high-level overview of kind of what was going on. And we're just trying to weave in responses to the questions that were submitted where we think it might be appropriate, but still kind of just going through a quick sort of overview of where we were with this. So obviously, again, thank you for the opportunity to be here. Operation Metro Surge was about 12 weeks long in duration. I'll talk briefly about sort of the work going on in the police department before that, kind of where we were going into this. Both the reform work as well as public safety in the city, and some revisions around policy that specifically impact immigration enforcement, and then kind of take a quick overview of how this thing unfolded. So just to get started out, an operations update, a summary chronologically of the surge, and then the impacts it had on the department. June through December, there had been progress made in a number of areas in the department. I think one thing that we had made significant impacts on over the last 6 months of last year were response times. Response times to emergency calls in the city had typically been about 7 minutes or less on average. They had gone up on average 9 minutes or higher, and had remained that way for quite some time. Going into the surge, we had gotten it back down to about 7.5 minutes, and it kind of lost that while the surge was happening. We're back down to about 7.5 minutes now, so that's significant. We're aware of, trends with violent crime. Murder has been down significantly. Shooting victims have been down significantly, particularly on the north side of the city. Last year was the lowest number of shooting victims in North Minneapolis since the city has been recording shooting victims, separately from aggravated assault. So I think it goes back to about 2008. Last year had been the lowest number of victims on the north side. Burglary and auto theft have been down last year, and then also significantly around this, when we're trying to implement all of this reform work, Minneapolis has the unique challenge that we're also trying to rebuild the workforce at the same time. So mass exodus of employees. Most of the time I've been chief, we've been losing employees continuously and not having a net gain. Last year we hired 125, we had a net gain of about 125 people for sworn positions. The majority of them are not yet officers, and they're overwhelmingly people of color. It's a lot more diverse than the police department here had historically ever been, and many of them are from countries around the world, different continents around the world. The overarching way that the reform work has been approached has been community engagements. There's been a number of sessions. There's a whole process defined by the settlement agreement, the way policy is developed, and then once it's developed, that leads ultimately to the training. And the reform work last year, there were 29 policies that had been approved. There was one called the Policy Resource Hub. It's sort of a document management system that had been implemented. Prior to this, the only access employees had to policy was through a PDF document. So this is something that's a lot more modern. It's available on officers' phones. It has keyword searches. It links to other policies. And it's better for accountability as new policies are issued to ensure that everyone has received them. There were over 20,000 hours of training delivered last year. And in terms of engagement in the reform process, there were 24 focus groups, 10 community sessions, and really countless pieces of community feedback that were received. The immigration policy revamp. This started happening last year as a result of the incident that happened on June 3rd at Lake in Bloomington, which caught us by surprise and kind of got us sucked into a situation that we're able to learn from. And quite frankly, the process then that we seeking feedback from this body, from the community in general, help to inform what the immigration enforcement policy in the city would be. And I think that was helpful to place the police department in a better position going into December. If we had gone into this cold, we wouldn't have been as well prepared as we were at the time. And just going through this thing, which was unprecedented and truly was, the world was upside down going through this. We learned as we went along. We did the best we could to adjust as we were learning things that were happening. And I'll talk about that when I get into some of the specifics with the timeline. But in talking about the policy, there's some questions that came up that I think are relevant to this. One being the training. There's a question, how much training is provided for policies, in person, online, especially, use of force, duty to intervene, and these types of subjects. So last year there was 3 full days of training that was provided, 8 hours each to every sworn member of the department, and that was the training around use of force and the issues specific to that. That's training that was developed as a result of the settlement agreement process here, and ultimately training that was approved by the independent monitor towards that. So that's one example. Use of force, 24 hours of training. There's a wide variety on types of training, hours required. As I mentioned before, there were 20,000 hours of training that were delivered by the department. There's training that's required by the state. So there is really just a wide variety of training requirements. Some of it is in person, some of it is online. It just depends on what the particular topic is. Training provided to officers, past or future, on how to intervene as safely as possible when excessive force is being used by federal agents. Due to the duty to intervene training for MPD is historically for the way the state law is set up. It's for people that are operating under the same set of laws that are licensed as peace officers in Minnesota. So it's very obvious to us we're trained in the state law here. We have the same law regarding use of force, and although internal policies between different police departments in Minnesota can vary, the law does not change. There's no current policy or training, specifically on how to intervene with people who are operating under a different set of laws, whether that's another state or, in this case, the U.S. Code. There's different court decisions that impact federal law enforcement that do not impact Minneapolis to Minnesota peace officers. It's a very complex situation, and it is not one specifically. Local officers in this state are just not trained on what the laws are, what the use of force continuum is for the different federal agencies. And 2, we operate under the state laws in this state. What guidance is provided on how to handle situations when federal agents violate local laws? The examples were speeding, reckless driving, that type of thing. There is no specific guidance on how to enforce those particular local laws on federal law enforcement. I think with all of these things, it's very easy to deal with if you're dealing with an officer that is, whatever agency they are, that is off duty. They're acting as a private citizen. Once we have federal law enforcement that are acting in the performance of their duties under federal law, you get a much more complicated situation. And again, it's one that just we are not trained on. We don't know the laws that they're operating on. We don't know their policies, their court decisions around these things. So it just becomes in a very unusual situation and unprecedented. What do you believe the need will be for more training regarding the policy 9-401. We're adding additional language and reporting requirements. There's work that's going on between the implementation unit and the city attorney's office to provide those updates, and it's going through the typical policy development process. And there's some questions around interacting with federal agents that I think is also relevant to when we're talking about the policy. How can MPD officers engage with federal agents to enforce the law and halt unlawful and objectively dangerous behavior by agents as well as people posing as federal agents? So typically, under the separation ordinance and under the policy, MPD officers cannot engage with federal agents while they're conducting immigration enforcement. The separation ordinance specifically prohibits MPD from cooperating with federal law enforcement for those purposes. So in addition to that, we don't know beforehand, we're not told by them what specific enforcement operations they're conducting, where they're conducting it, who they're targeting, and those types of things. So it makes all of this just incredibly complicated. Obviously at the scenes of the different shootings that we had, there were a number of members of the community that helped the police officers to try and de-escalate things, to keep people safe. That was both elected officials, members of the city council, state elected officials, the state senator, state representative, but also just regular residents. Because at those scenes, the primary objective for the police department was, one, to try and keep the peace, but two, to try and preserve the evidence of the scene. You cannot possibly have an investigation, let alone a potential prosecution, unless there's evidence to be used to obtain not just a charge in some case, but ultimately for a court to have a conviction if it's needed. So what other directives or factors prevented MPD from enforcing local laws in these situations? Even in situations where police may have been there after the fact, which generally we were not there because of the policy, because of the separation ordinance, because that's largely what the community wanted going into this. We wouldn't know at the time, just showing up, what exactly federal law enforcement was doing, what laws they were enforcing, why they were arresting someone. They literally have different laws, let alone different policies. They have a totally different authority than what we do. We have no authority whatsoever to enforce federal law, to enforce federal immigration law. In the same respects, they have no authority to enforce the traffic law in the state. So it's just literally two completely separate lanes that just add a complexity to all of this. So talking back again with the policy revamp that went through a process here that I know the commissioners are aware of. We issued it to the entire department, required every member of the department to sign off that they understood it, and it ensured that our police officers, one, do not self-deploy to any of these scenes, but if they do wind up on a scene where federal law enforcement is also present, that they will only take direction from supervisors in the Minneapolis Police Department, and they will not take direction from federal law enforcement. It was complicated at all of these scenes, because again, regardless of what people think about what they were doing, what we feel about how they were doing it, these agencies are established by law, and we have to follow the law. We cannot, physically obstruct and stop them from conducting law enforcement. So it was just an incredibly complicated situation. Bringing us now, so the policy's revised, it's implemented, bringing us now to December, and it's at the beginning of the month. Obviously, the surge happens. This is just a quick timeline of some of the major events. It's announced in the beginning of December. By December 9th, there's an American citizen that was arrested in Cedar Riverside. This kind of, one of the first kind of public moments with this. December 15th, that was a day there was a help call. Federal law enforcement called 911 and said, I don't remember, it said a very high number of law enforcement officers were actively being assaulted at 29th and Pillsbury. So what typically happens when the communications department receives a 911 call from another agency saying that there's a trooper needs help or a sheriff's deputy needs help, they hit a tone on the radio, and sort of everyone who's available from around the city just goes to the scene. And that's what happened on this day. And immediately when that happened, I was afraid we were going to wind up having a repeat of what happened on June 3rd, which was people were very concerned at why is MPD at the scene with federal law enforcement again. And our officers went, they thought they were going to something where federal law enforcement was being assaulted. They saw there was no actual violence going on while we were there, observed any threats of violence. In less than 10 minutes, the officers disengaged and left the scene. After that, to try and prevent these things from happening, and this is now like the number of calls and things are escalating at the time. I created a full-time position, and we opened up an operations center to try and monitor things that were happening so that if federal law enforcement or somebody calling reported something like that again, we did not wind up going and getting thrown into a situation that was not true. That ultimately then would wind up having MPD be the problem or having MPD unnecessarily escalate a situation. So that's sort of the first significant change we made in our procedures then. Around January 5th is when this is escalated further. The Bovino was sent to the city. There's over 2,000 additional agents from a variety of agencies. They're here, so I believe it's over 3,000. I think at this point. There's Border Patrol, ICE, HSI. Eventually, there were Federal Bureau of Prisons officers here, Customs and Border Protection. It's at least 3,000 agents that wind up coming here. Obviously, a very, very significant escalation. And I ordered every member of the police department to be in uniform on January 6th. Our investigators, all of our people, because I was afraid that we were going to have something happen that would require a very large police response to try and keep the city safe. And unfortunately, the very next day is when Renee Good was killed. Now that day, we responded to the scene, and there were literally a few hundred ICE agents there, and we were able to get them to leave eventually, because their presence alone was just escalating things. And there was real concern both at one, trying to preserve evidence, but two, trying to keep people safe. Eventually they left. Many members of the city council and elected officials were there trying to help de-escalate things, members of the community. And for the most part, that day was, that scene was calm for most of it until the very end. At the very end, there were people throwing ice, rocks, and other things. There were several officers and state troopers that wound up being injured while the police were trying to leave the city. The following week, there was the shooting on the north side, which was non-fatal. And is not really publicly, it seems like hasn't been talked too much. It kind of gets lost with the two fatalities. That was a much more tense scene that day. There were federal law enforcement was using tear gas. Police officers had to respond in to help a family with a child that was having trouble breathing from the tear gas. And it was very, very quickly, it had become a very unsafe situation. The following week, in the midst of, obviously, there's protests, demonstrations going on all throughout this, the Vice President visits the city in the middle of all of these things happening. Ultimately, on the 24th, we know Mr. Preddy is killed, and really it's that day. That day, I think, was the greatest risk that we had of just having widespread destruction and starting off the cycle that we had in 2020, where people ultimately lost their lives. 26th, on the 26th and 27th, Bovino is ultimately reassigned, and we know the drawdown.